Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel where, if you know me, you'll know that I love nothing more than painting Warhammer, but not just any run-of-the-mill Johnny Space Marine Warhammer, because for some ungodly reason, my brain and creative juices tend to gravitate towards the crustiest, ugliest, and most importantly, the oldest miniatures that this hobby has to offer. And for a while now, that's kind of become my entire jam and sort of a subsect of the hobby that I've come to really enjoy and that somehow keeps me sane. Taking old Warhammer miniatures, scrubbing them up, giving them a fresh lick of paint, and then hopefully a very impressive before and after transformation. Just like this guy here. Ta-da! But something which I haven't tried and I guess I'd never considered is that I could be doing the exact same thing with my latest hobby obsession, Gundam. Gundam, in my mind, as someone who's only fairly recently gotten into it, is a thoroughly modern hobby, but that's probably because the kits that I've been buying, building, and enjoying have all been released in the last 10 years and contain all the best of the best qualities, color separations, engineering marvels, and gimmicks that Bandai, one of the biggest toy companies in the world, has to offer. But even Gundam must have had its very own humble beginnings, and that got me thinking, what was the first ever Gundam kit? What did it look like? How did it build? And how is it different from the modern Gundam kits that we know and love today? Well, today I am here to answer all of these questions and more because I managed to get my hands on the first Gundam model kit ever made, and we are gonna give it the full Rogue Hobbies crusty old miniature makeover. Yay. So get comfy and stick around because in this video we are not only going to take a detailed deep dive into this legendary model kit which was made when Games Workshop was just the twinkle in a nerd's eye, but also I'm going to see just how far I can push this somewhat dated model kit into the 21st century using all of my skills as a professional miniature painter. Makeover. Whoosh. So firstly, as a little confession before we start, this is not the only, old vintage Gundam kit that I have bought. Not at all. In fact, as you can see here, I've kind of been stockpiling and dragon hoarding these old Gundam kits for a while now, mostly because I think they just look awesome. I absolutely adore the kind of maximalist vintage Japanese graphic design on all the boxes, and I especially love the sick 80s art of all the mobile suits on the fronts as well. It's all just extremely hell yeah. But I have to admit that whilst I do now have a pretty strong collection of these bad boys, I have yet to crack open or build a single one of them. Classic me. But fortunately for all of us here today, including myself, the time to do so is right now. And like I hinted to earlier, we're not just gonna pick any old kit to unbox and build and react to. We are going straight for the OG and in fact the very first Gundam model kit to ever be produced, which is this RX-78 2-suit right here. That's right, this guy here was the very first Gundam kit ever, and it was released in Japan in July of 1980, just a year after the franchise first aired on TV, and it was sold for just 300 yen, or I think around £1.50 in Great British pounds, which is pretty cheap. I'm sure it was more expensive back then because conversion rates and time, but still, pretty cheap, pretty good. And whilst this is technically the oldest Gundam kit ever, he's maybe not actually as old as you may think he is. Let me explain. Gundam, and I guess Bandai, have this fun thing where they will reprint their kits periodically, and some go as far as to say that Bandai have kind of never stopped producing these very old kits since their initial releases. So all of these vintage boxes, whilst having original release dates which could range from the 80s to the early 90s, may have actually been produced and come out of the factory anywhere from the late 90s to the swingin' 20s. And what's what's even better, or maybe worse depending on how much you love grungly old miniatures, is that Bandai don't do a lot to update the miniatures when they reproduce them. Insofar as the molds they're using now to churn these model kits out are the same ones, or at least near identical to the ones that they used when they first got released. And opening up one of these boxes 40 years later is apparently an exactly identical experience as doing the same in the 80s. And apparently they have also kept the vintage price tag on these miniatures, as in, if you wanted to buy one in Japan, it would still be 300 yen. And I don't know if that's true, but if it is, I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, I won't be able to tell you for sure exactly how old and crusty this particular box here is until I open it up and take a look at the sprue. But an easy way to tell at a glance roughly when your kit is from, if you have one of these reprints, is to have a look at which iteration of the Bandai logo is on the side of the box. Mine is the red Bandai logo before it became the modern blue Bandai Namco one, which means that this reprint is probably from around the 90s to the early 2000s. So with that brief history lesson out the way, let's finally crack open this bad boy and take a little look at what Bandai's very first Gundam model kit actually looked like. Oh, it kind of just looks like modern Warhammer. Okay, and honestly, given that I went into this kit completely blind and I did no prior research at all to kind of avoid the spoilers, this was honestly a bit of a surprise. The kit comes with and is essentially entirely comprised of two very simple looking greenish white sprues, or I guess in this case runners, and a small folded double-sided assembly guide which has printed colour on the front and shows a runner rundown, a colour guide, and of course the construction guide entirely in Japanese. Taking a more detailed look at the sprues themselves here is unfortunately a little bit tricky because of this bright sort of greenish off-white colour which is sucking in my strong overhead light and kind of spewing it back out at the camera in a very unpleasant way. But yeah, the detail on the plastic itself here looks pretty good and actually not bad at all, I'd say. The sculpt is simple, that's for sure, with a bunch of big smooth panels and areas, but around the more detailed areas like the gun and the face, this model looks like it's come out of the plastic mold, sharp and crisp. And now that we can see the runners clearly, I can confirm using these handy little dials here on the side of the sprue that this particular reprint was made in August of 1993, making it just 1 year younger than me. Anyways, despite the sprue itself looking, at a glance, quite modern and even alright actually, it does become a little bit more dated, of course, when you compare it to modern Gundam or even modern Warhammer. Modern Warhammer plastic sprues, as we know, can be insanely detailed and fine and glorious to behold, and of course comparing this sprue to modern Gundam is almost night and day as well, considering just how far Bandai has come with their color separation, engineering, and all the cool gimmicks that we recognize in Gundam in the modern age. However, I know what you guys are thinking because honestly, when I opened the box up, it was the first thing that I thought too. And that is, isn't it crazy that at the same time that Games Workshop were smelting their first lead miniatures and rocks like the impoverished orcs in Mordor, Bandai were releasing what looks like semi-modern Warhammer. And like, yeah, that is kind of amusing, but it does make sense, and I'm gonna explain why. We have to remember that in the 80s, Bandai was one of the largest toy companies in the world and was the biggest in Japan, and at the same time, Games Workshop was just a room full of D&D nerds with cool hair and a dream. So I think it's a bit of a disservice in hindsight to maybe compare and contrast Games Workshop's humble casting and smelting beginnings in the 80s to Bandai's phenomenally financially and technologically backed first ever kit. However, it is still just a little bit funny to think that 3 years after this very modern kit was made, this little guy got released by what is now a company making a sort of similar quality thing. Anyways, with all that being said, let us finally get round to building this old baby man. Yeah. Now, the first thing I noticed when I was building this kit was the quality of the plastic, and I don't know if this is just like a 90s kit thing, but the plastic here did feel a little harder and a touch on the brittle side compared to what I'm used to with modern Gundam. So for that reason, I chose not to use my fancy god hands, but instead I opted for these very sturdy but still kind of fancy steady clippers that I usually use for my Warhammer building. But the second thing, which makes this kit a lot different from regular modern Gundam, is that this kit requires glue to assemble it. Shocking, I know. And this is a bit of a laugh, I suppose, for us Warhammer guys who, in all of our 30 plus years of having plastic kits, have never and probably will never own a miniature which does not require glue to assemble. So I find it kind of funny to imagine that for a die-hard Gundam fan, the concept of assembly using glue is archaic, old-fashioned, and maybe even a turn-off for building this kit. But fortunately for me, I was born in the dark. You merely adapted it. Brain. Oh yeah, and also the instructions for this kit, like I said earlier, are the exact same as they were in the 80s and thus are absolutely not translated into English like modern kits are as well. But still, the diagrams were clear and simple and easy to understand, and of course, Google Translate is a thing, so I really wasn't finding following along to be the most complicated thing in the world either. But concerning the build process itself, I was finding myself being actually quite pleasantly surprised and a little bit impressed as well, because even on this first ever kit, there is still articulation built into the model. The head can move on its socket, and each of the arms and legs also have 3 points of articulation too, which gives it quite good movement. And obviously, it's nothing like the posability of modern Gundam model kits today at all, but still, it's very cool and really impressive to see that this very first kit still had some posability built into it. But as I continued to build it and put everything together, I did realize quite soon that whilst the kit looks impressive and it looks like, I don't know, modern Warhammer and all that jazz, in reality it was a little bit ropey. There are a lot of gaps, seam lines, and kind of wonky connections on this kit, and to kind of get around that, I was using a lot of plastic glue, which meant that I could kind of melt the parts together, let them cure fully, and then scrub the seams and the messy bits as hard as I could with my little sandpaper sticks to make everything a lot smoother. But eventually I got him polished off, glued together, and finally assembled, but loosely. Kinda loosely. As in, some of the joints, when I popped them all together, were just kind of not jointing, and they were a bit on the loosey-goosey side, and that meant that he kept on, like, crumbling, squeaking around, and falling over under his own weight, which made him a little bit of a nightmare to photograph and film, but also it was kinda funny to watch, so whatever. But saying all of that, for a kit that was released in 1980 nothing, I think that he's pretty rad. Whilst it's obviously nowhere near reaching the glitz and glam and technological feats of modern Gundam, it's still cool, detailed, recognizable, and posable. Kind of. But as is painfully obvious here, this model, when it's fully assembled, looks nothing like he does on the front or the side of the box, and is in dire need of a few licks of paint. And a knee brace. Damn. Before we get into the proper painting, I have to make a confession here, which is that I did end up gluing him into position with a little bit of super glue. I just couldn't deal with him constantly being all wiggly and squeaky and performing admittedly very sickening death drops on me when I was painting him. So sorry if his lack of articulation causes any distress for you Gundam fans. My bad. Either way, the instruction booklet he comes with has this handy little guide to colouring the model, which includes instructions to use water-based paints and always paint with the windows open, but I don't have windows in my room, so we're not doing that. And also, I love fumes. They make me happy. The guide calls for what is only a few colors over what I believe is just the bare off-white plastic of the model itself. But because I'm me and I'm kind of extra or stupid, depending on who you ask, we won't be doing any of that, and instead we are going to prime this entire miniature black and paint it like it's Warhammer. And if you're sat there asking, now Louise, why would you prime a dominantly white miniature in black primer? Well, there's a very good reason for that, and that's because... Anyways, I decided that instead of keeping it super simple like the instructions guided me to, or instead of making him look very modern with a grimy, weathered paint job like I have done with some of my previous painted Gundam models, I'd instead honor the source material and also the era that he's from as much as I could by trying to recreate that very graphic box art style on the miniature itself. My plan to execute this style was to basically try and make some bolder light and shadow choices, especially with my white tones, utilize the big sharp details and panels to make some big smooth gradients, and then finish everything off with some crisp edge highlights to kind of recreate this very graphic and almost cel-shaded style. And as someone who admittedly isn't the most competent in the world at working out light placement on miniatures, this was honestly a little bit of a struggle for me. Like, I always feel like when I try and do this style of painting, I'm just not bold or brash enough, and even when I am bold with my color choices, I just don't kind of get it enough for it to look good. So once I'd finished all the whites on the head, I was a little bit worried about how this was all going to come together in the end, until I started to add in all the other super iconic and popping colors on the head, and then I was like, oh, never mind, this is fine actually. It's funny how returning to my comfort zone, which is extremely bright colors, suddenly made what felt like a bit of a rocky start kind of click for me, and I was full steam ahead doing these yellows on his chest here, which I think may be some of the nicest yellows I've ever done. Another thing which really rewired my brain into successfully painting in this style was learning how to use gradients in the most effective way possible. So as you can see here on the chest, I really went to town and spent ages creating the smoothest, rich blue blend that I could. And here is the secret sauce. Even though the imaginary light source is theoretically coming from the top down, I made the lighter color be at the bottom of the gradient and not the top. And this kind of makes the area look shinier because the light is bouncing around at the bottom, just like it does when we're painting something very shiny, like a gemstone. Either way, I think it was definitely a mixture of these big smooth gradients, some bold shadow and light placements, and some lovely neat edge highlights that was absolutely selling this paint job for me and was also making it super fun to do as well. That being said, when it came around to painting the legs, my brain was kind of fried a little bit, and I really did my best to be very, very smart and start plotting in the blocks of highlights and shadows, but I really struggled to get them looking correct in this area, which is funny because on the little miniature version of this exact same suit, the legs were actually my favorite part to paint. But these legs were big and chunky and weirdly shaped, and no shame to the legs themselves, I think they're stunning, but like I said, I just struggled a lot with the light placement here, and it was a bit of a nightmare to work out, and in the end the legs just aren't the best work that I've ever done. But that's okay, and I'm cool admitting that, because miniature painting is about practicing and struggling and learning from that struggle, and that is something I definitely did do here, and I think the legs don't look that bad in the end, so yay me. All of his accessories, however, like his big old shield, his beam saber, and his awesome gun, I'm glad to say were really good fun to paint, but it was here that I did break one of my own rules just a little bit on this miniature. I told myself at the beginning of this project that I was going to do my best to keep the paint job kind of simple and most importantly, as close to the cover art as I possibly could. And this meant no extra adding of panels, no freehanding, no chipping or weathering, and especially no cool modern painting effects. And trust me, this was a struggle because I really wanted to paint in the iconic Earth Federation logo onto that big blank space on the shield, but it's not on the artwork, so I resisted. However, when it came to the weapons, I did end up doing just a few extra little effects. On the beam saber, I decided that it was a bit boring being just red, so I added a small glowy effect just at the bottom to make it look a little bit more engaging and cool, and on the gun, I couldn't resist freehanding in this totally sick lens onto that extremely flat surface on the scope, which I think ended up looking really cool, so I think it's okay that I broke the rules twice, just as a little treat for me, especially after I suffered so much on the legs, so I think it's fine. But with the main suit all painted and put together, it was time to answer what is always my least favorite question, which is, how should I base him? So on paper, I guess this guy doesn't really need a base. Like, I have a bunch of free range, freestanding, free bird Gundams on my shelf, just chilling out and being cool guys. But since his pose is a little bit wobbly and he is an old man, I thought it would be best if he had just a bit more support on him. But fortunately for me, I had a cunning plan to use his base as an opportunity to make this miniature resemble the box art even more. Just like the Disney princess's famous pink void of the 2010s, our Gundam's void is this awesome backlit green spotlight, which I think looks super cool, so we are definitely going to be paying a homage to that on our base. The standard Gundam base is usually this big clear acrylic hexagon, so I decided to kind of riff on that and also incorporate the same design as my previous sculpted Gundam base, which I made for my Gundam Assemble miniature, to kind of produce this big fat hexagon Gundam base, which I think looks really neat. In order to liken it back to our delightful green void, I chose to paint the base in the same sort of glowy green colors as the one on the box. And again, I'm really not used to painting a lot of flat surfaces, especially at this ungodly large scale. And because I'm too lazy to get an airbrush or airbrush anything these days, there was a lot of going back and forth with balancing my colors with this super big fluffy dry brush, and there was even more trusting the process here. But in the end, I think the base looked really good. And with the base done and dusted, it was time to put the whole thing together, and well, that would be giving it away. So let's cut right to the beauty shots. Let's go. And here he is, Gundam's very first model kit, given a thoroughly modern makeover. And I gotta say that this was the most fun to do. Like I said before, whilst I have painted a few Gundam kits in the past, I've never gone this hard or used such a fun reference before. And as usual, when it comes to me painting these kits, I ended up once again learning a whole lot from doing so. It seems that whenever I paint up one of these guys, it pushes me out of my nice small-scale Warhammer comfort zone and forces me to think about miniature painting in an entirely new way, which also kind of forces me to improve my skills a whole lot. In this case, I think it was all of those smooth gradients and areas of bouncing light that taught me loads about how to make a mini look cool, clean, and graphic without it looking messy or overworked. And I can't wait to translate these new skills onto a smaller miniature because, yeah, I think this guy looks awesome. But as always, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you love this old school paint job on this old school miniature, or do you wish that maybe I had modernized him a bit more with some weathering and modern techniques to bring him a little bit more into the 21st century? And speaking of which, I really have to stress the point that by the time I got to the end of painting this miniature, in fact, I think that around halfway through, I completely forgot I was painting the world's first Gundam kit. Like, I truly entered my flow state, and upon reflection, whilst the building stage was a little bit shaky at the start, I think that this kit is awesome, cool, and really well detailed. And actually, painting it as a modern painter 40 plus years after its release didn't feel that different from what I usually do, and I think that's pretty cool. This model has really stood the test of time, and I can't wait for him to be displayed proudly and without shame next to his much younger stronger and more articulated brothers. But I'm afraid that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. And as always, thank you for being rogues. I will see you in the next one. Bye. Bye. Bye bye.